They thought the noise would die down, but instead it just got louder, sharper, and far more dangerous. Because now suddenly there's talk of a hospital insider stepping forward, quietly, privately, but with just enough detail to shake the entire narrative to its core. And the moment that whisper hit the surface, everything changed. Because this isn't just another recycled rumor floating around the internet anymore. This is the kind of claim that hits differently. This is the kind that makes even the most competent PR teams pause for a second longer than usual. And that's exactly why people are saying the Meghan camp didn't just respond, they scrambled. They picked the wrong fight this time. Meghan Markle's legal team may have thought another warning letter would scare people into silence. That line alone tells you everything about the tone of this moment. Because what we're watching right now doesn't feel like a shutdown, it feels like a standoff that's escalating in real time. And when names like Lady Colin Campbell and Tom Bower are sitting right in the center of it, things don't stay quiet for long. Now here's where it gets even more intense. Tom Bower didn't come out swinging with a full-blown reveal. No, he did something far more calculated. He hinted, he teased, he dropped just enough to make people lean in. And what he hinted at was not vague gossip, it was something specific. A so-called insider, someone connected to a hospital, someone allegedly who reached out. Think about that for a second. Because in the story already drowning in speculation, timelines, and unanswered questions, the introduction of an insider changes the energy completely. It shifts the conversation from what people think to what someone might know. And that distinction is exactly what makes this moment feel explosive. He said checks had already been made involving hospitals in both London and California. What stood out most was not what was found, but what was not found. That line didn't just spark curiosity, it triggered a wave. Because now people aren't just asking questions, they're connecting dots. And when the phrase "what was not found" enters the conversation, it creates a vacuum. And you already know how this works. Vacuums don't stay empty, they get filled fast. So suddenly timelines that once seemed settled are being dragged back into the spotlight. Announcements are being re-examined. Old clips are being replayed. Every word, every pause, every tiny detail is being treated like a clue hiding in plain sight. And right in the middle of all that noise, Lady C is doing something that's making this even more uncomfortable for the other side. She's not backing down. Not even slightly. Let him sue me. 4 words. Cold, calm, and completely unshaken. And that's the part people can't ignore. Because when someone sounds that certain, that steady, it doesn't feel like bluffing. It feels like confidence. And confidence in situations like this makes people wonder what's sitting behind the curtain. What do they think they know? What makes them so sure this won't collapse under pressure? And more importantly, what happens if this actually moves beyond words? Because here's the uncomfortable truth that keeps coming up again and again. If this turns into a real legal fight, everything changes. Completely. Once a defamation case gets serious, the fight stops being about headlines and starts being about records, messages, timelines. That's not a small shift. That's a total transformation of the battlefield. Because once records come into play, once timelines are tested, once statements are placed side by side under scrutiny, even the smallest inconsistency can suddenly become a major problem. And that's exactly why people are watching this moment so closely. Because on one side, you have a team that appears to be trying to contain the situation, to control the narrative, to push back quickly before anything grows too big. And on the other side, you have voices who seem almost ready for the pressure, ready for the escalation, ready to go further. That's not a normal media clash, that's a setup. And then there's the timing of this so-called insider contact. Why now? Why after all this time? Why when the conversation was already heating up again? These are the kinds of questions that don't just fade away. They linger, they grow. And the more they grow, the harder they are to contain. Because the reality is, this story has never really had closure. Not full closure. Not the kind that shuts everything down cleanly and permanently. It's always been this slow burning cloud of doubt, denial, and interpretation, constantly reignited by new angles, new voices, new claims. Not proof, not closure, not certainty, but the fact that the doubts never seem to fully go away. And now, with this new twist, that cloud just got thicker. Because an insider, real or rumored, adds a human element to the story. It suggests access. It suggests proximity. It suggests that maybe, just maybe, there are details that haven't been publicly laid out yet. And whether that's true or not almost doesn't matter at this stage. Because perception is is already doing the work. And once a story reaches that level where people are no longer reacting but actively investigating, replaying, comparing, and questioning, it stops behaving like a normal media moment and starts turning into something far more relentless, something that feeds on every new detail, whether confirmed or not. And that is exactly where this situation now sits, right on that edge where perception begins to carry as much weight as proof, and where even silence starts to feel like a statement. Because look at what is happening in real time. The conversation is no longer just about a claim, or even about a response to that claim. It has evolved into something broader, something more layered, something that people are treating almost like a puzzle that has been left incomplete for too long. Every old clip is being pulled back into circulation, every past statement is being re-examined under a new lens, and every tiny inconsistency, real or imagined, is being amplified to a level it probably never reached before. That is the effect of a moment like this, especially when a new element like a so-called insider enters the picture, because it gives people a reason to believe there might be something more beneath the surface. And once that belief takes hold, it spreads quickly. What makes this even more intense is the way both sides appear to be positioning themselves. On one side, there is this sense of tightening control, of trying to manage the fallout, to respond quickly, to prevent the situation from expanding into something even harder to contain. But on the other side, there is a very different energy, an almost deliberate refusal to step back, a willingness to keep pushing, to keep hinting, to keep the spotlight exactly where it is, because the longer the spotlight stays, the more pressure builds. And pressure changes everything, because pressure forces clarity, or at least the demand for it. It forces people to either step forward with something definitive or risk being pulled deeper into speculation that they no longer control. And that is exactly the crossroads this situation seems to be approaching, slowly but unmistakably. Because the longer this insider angle lingers without being fully addressed or completely dismantled, the more space it creates for interpretation. And interpretation is where stories like this grow the fastest. At the same time, the broader context around all of this is impossible to ignore. This is not happening in isolation. This is happening against the backdrop of years of public appearances, interviews, documentaries, carefully crafted narratives, and a brand that has been built very deliberately around openness, truth, and personal storytelling. That is what makes this moment feel so charged, because when questions begin to push against that image, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. And that contrast is exactly what critics are focusing on now, not just the claim itself, but the gap between the image that has been presented and the questions that are now being raised. And the more that gap is discussed, the more it becomes part of the story. What is also adding fuel to this situation is the growing conversation around what could happen if this ever moves beyond speculation and into something more formal. Because once legal processes enter the picture in a serious way, everything shifts. The focus moves away from headlines and into documentation, into timelines, into consistency. It becomes less about who sounds convincing and more about what can actually be supported when every detail is examined under pressure. And that is why the word discovery keeps coming up again and again in discussions around this, because it represents a level of scrutiny that goes far beyond anything seen in public interviews or media appearances. And that possibility alone is enough to keep people watching closely, because if it happens, it would not just be another chapter in a media saga. It would be a turning point, a moment where everything that has been said, implied, or hinted at gets tested in a completely different environment. And that is the scenario that seems to be hanging in the background of this entire situation, not confirmed, not guaranteed, but present enough to influence how both sides are acting right now. Meanwhile, the silence from traditional institutions only adds another layer to the story. There is no dramatic intervention, no clear public stance, just that familiar distance that leaves the conversation to unfold on its own. And when that happens, the vacuum is filled by speculation, by commentary, by endless analysis from every possible angle. That is how stories like this sustain themselves, not through one major revelation, but through a constant cycle of questions that never quite get resolved. And now, with this latest twist, that cycle has been reset again, because the idea of an insider, even if it remains unverified, has introduced a new level of intrigue that is hard to ignore. It suggests access to something more concrete, something closer to the source, and whether that suggestion holds any real weight or not becomes almost secondary to the effect it creates. Because once people start to believe that someone on the inside side might be speaking, the entire narrative shifts from speculation to possibility. And possibility is far more powerful in keeping a story alive. So the situation sits in this strange, unstable place where nothing has been definitively proven, but nothing has been fully dismissed either, where responses are quick, but questions are quicker, where confidence meets scrutiny, and neither side seems willing to step away. And that is why this moment feels different, because it is not just about what has been said, it is about what might come next. It is about whether this insider angle leads to something more concrete, or whether it fades like so many other claims before it. It is about whether the pressure continues to build, pushing the situation toward a breaking point, or whether it stabilizes just enough to avoid that outcome. But right now, there is no clear answer, only momentum. And momentum, once it reaches this level, is incredibly difficult to stop, because every new day without a definitive resolution adds another layer to the story, another reason for people to keep watching, keep questioning, keep connecting dots that may or may not actually connect. And as long as that process continues, the spotlight does not dim, it gets brighter. So now the real question is not just what has already been said, but what happens if something more does surface? What happens if this insider claim evolves into something tangible, something that can be examined, challenged, or confirmed? What happens if the situation moves from implication to confrontation in a way that forces clarity instead of speculation? Because if that happens, everything changes again. And until then, the tension remains exactly where it is now, unresolved, escalating, and impossible to ignore.